Hi, this is Dina for Splitcoaststampers. This week's technique is a layered gesso background. Gesso is usually used like a primer to prepare surfaces for painting, but if you don't have it, don't worry. For a technique like this, you can just use acrylic paint. I'm working on mixed media paper, but if you don't have that, heavy cardstock or watercolor paper will be heavy enough for this technique. Since we're working on paper, we don't really need the gesso as a primer, but the thickness of the gesso gives dimension and texture to your background. And you'll notice that as you start brushing it on, you'll see the brush strokes, and I like to vary the direction of my strokes and also leave some texture there. If you prefer a smoother background, you could use a sponge brush for this step. Also be sure to let your project dry completely after you finish each layer. I'm adding some stamped images from Penny Black for my next layer. For this step, you'll need an ink that will stick to an acrylic medium and also stand up to a wet medium without bleeding. Here I'm using Memento Luxe ink. You can also use Colorbox Fluid Chalk ink, Ranger Archival inks, VersaFine, and I'm sure there are others too. Play around with what you have and see what works for you. I'm not worried about perfect inking or perfect stamping on this layer because I know parts of it are going to be covered up. I kind of like the imperfection, and it's also easier to layer images if they don't have clearly defined edges. I heat set my stamping, and now I'm adding a layer of acrylic paint, and since I'm using a darker color, I watered it down just a little bit. You'll see how the acrylic paint kind of sinks into the grooves of my brush strokes, and also picks up where the gesso wasn't really even. Another layer of gesso adds a little more texture and also helps to soften some of this stamping in acrylic paint. If you find that you've added too much gesso, you can always paint and stamp right over that and add more layers to your project. Mixed media is very forgiving. This is a metallic finish called Inka Gold. It's wax-based and it's really fun for adding texture and metallic color to your projects. I'm applying it with a tissue here, but on another sample I applied it with my finger and I felt I had more control. So it's another one of those things where you play around with it and find out what works for you. A great way to add dimension and texture to your panel is to use a dimensional medium applied through a stencil. You can use modeling or molding paste for this, but if you don't have those, acrylic caulking works really well too. I put a little bit on an acrylic block and then apply it with an old library card. This is just regular household caulking like you would use in your bathtub. And because it's acrylic, you can paint over it, which makes it really fun for mixed media. Here's my background up close so you can see the texture and the layers. There are no rules for mixed media, but if you're thinking about getting started with mixed media and don't know where to start, this tutorial is a great jumping point for creating your own backgrounds. Hopefully I've shared some tips that will help you in your process. Here are some finished projects, and I hope you'll share yours in the gallery. Thank you so much for watching.